Morning everyone. Today we'll look at one more topic from your mains paper for the essay, and the topic that we look at today is the second topic from section A, which is that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. But before I begin with this, for those who might be viewing this for the first time, briefly let me again recap what we discussed earlier. In your essay, ideally keep the exercise as simple, as straightforward as possible. 8 paragraphs that you write to create a very good, very effective essay. And these 8 paragraphs we divide into 4 parts. The introduction, body paragraph number 1, body paragraph number 2 to 6, which is 5 more paragraphs, and finally your conclusion. And for each of them, the intention, the impact is different. In the introduction, we provide a preview of what we are going to write. In body paragraph number 1, and again, like I've said earlier also, very importantly, in reflective essays, this paragraph is where you convey your interpretation of the topic. What you think, what you understand this topic is about. Paragraph number 2 to 6, body paragraph 2 to 6, you provide different perspectives, different dimensions through which you discuss the topic. And finally, in your conclusion, you provide one last reinforcement, one last look at the topic. Now, keeping this in mind, this is the topic that we are looking at today. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Now, when you're writing on something like this, now again, students have the question, how do I prepare for reflective essays? It can be very wide. The canvas of the essay can be extremely wide. Please remember, the canvas may be very wide, but what we said earlier also, in these essays, what matters most importantly is the symbolism behind the essay. What matters most importantly is how you can connect that topic with diverse areas, diverse perspectives, diverse dimensions of human life and human existence. For example, when we say poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, I've been getting a couple of emails from students, and students are asking that, sir, can I interpret the topic a little more liberally? Instead of just talking about poets, can I also talk about authors? Can I also talk about painters? Can I also talk about artists? You can, but why do you need to? You are from one of the culturally most vibrant countries in the world, which is India. We have n number of poets who have contributed in n number of ways to the country. Then why are you looking for an artist or for an author or for a painter? Why don't you restrict your discussion specifically? You can use them if you want, but it would be far better if you can focus the discussion only on poets and how they are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. How you do that? There are abundant examples to write here, but I'll just come to them in a minute. First, interpret the topic correctly. How do you interpret the topic? To interpret the topic, again, we ask 3 simple questions over here, and these 3 questions should cover the key dimensions, the key parts of the topic. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. So first question I ask myself is, what exactly does a legislator do? What does a legislator do? What does a lawmaker do? He provides a voice. He provides a platform to the ideals, to the objectives, to the aspirations of the nation. Whatever a nation wants to work upon, whatever a nation believes is important, a legislator will give a voice to those ideals and aspirations. Now, legislators, more importantly, more precisely, what do? They make laws for us. And what do we call a law? We say that a law is the collective conscience of the nation, which is given to us in a codified manner. The law of a country at any point in time represents what we call the collective conscience of the nation in a written, black and white, codified form. That is what a legislator does. Second, how are the poets legislators of the world? How do I draw a connection? What do you mean when we say that a poet is a legislator? Now, any law that has to be made will be made by your legislator, will be made by your lawmaker. But there are 3 organs, the state, the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive. Higher than the 3 organs of the state are the ideals on which the nation is built. Now, these ideals of the nation, they don't exist in a vacuum. These ideals are given to us, are shaped for us, they evolve over a period of time based upon the interaction between your state on the one hand and your society on the other. The society at any, in one of the earlier discussions that we had, I said that the essay paper does not have a lot in common with any optional. Any option that you want to look at, whether it is political science, whether it is philosophy, whether it is history, any option, it does not, it can borrow from there, but it's not directly related. What it is directly related to is your ethics paper. In ethics, for example, we say that the government is a very small part of society. So if you have a legislator working inside the government or working inside the organ of the state, more precisely, he will not be independent, he will not be free of the influences of society. It is society that helps us understand what are the ideals, what are the aspirations, what is the vision that the country wants to achieve. These ideals on which the nation is built, who will give them a form? These ideals are given a definite form, are encapsulated, are verbalized by our poets. And they're not only verbalized by poets. Poets don't only write poems, they help us capture these ideals in a simple and in a memorable form. A small child learns a poem. Now, when we talk about poems for children, we're not talking about, that Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star or Johnny, Johnny. We're not talking about those. We're talking about slightly better poems. But once a child learns these poems at the age of 5, at the age of 10, at the age of 15, these poems for a very long time define what these children believe their nation, their country, or even the world is all about. Once these poets verbalize the ideas of the nation, the ideals of the nation, this now leads to an ideological revolution. This now leads to a social revolution, leads to a cultural revolution. You can even say it leads to a mental revolution within the society. This ideological revolution in our society becomes the basis in the future for our laws. Which is why, in an indirect manner, the poets are the legislators of the world. But there's one more word here. Poets, I understand what legislators do, they make laws. I understand that poets provide the impetus, provide the platform through which, on the basis of which, the laws are going to be made. But how are the poets unacknowledged? Now, here we said that they write these ideas, they verbalize these ideas in a simple and memorable form. Once we go through these poems, once we read these poems, we understand the idea in a simple manner, we understand the idea, we also internalize the idea. But when we understand, when we identify with these ideas, when we internalize these thoughts, after some time, we start forgetting that these thoughts come from a particular poem, come from a particular person. We internalize the thoughts, but we forget their origin. And over a period of time, once we start forgetting the origin, we remember the poem, we remember the thoughts behind the poem, but we start claiming ownership over these ideas, believing that the ideas belong to us, forgetting that the idea was given to us. These very abstract ideas around us were given us clear form, a clear definition by that poet. This is why, and this is how the poets become the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Now, this is your interpretation of the topic. Once you understand the interpretation, where are you going to write this? This you will write briefly and simply in body paragraph number 1. But I have an introduction, I have a conclusion, and I have 5 more body paragraphs to write. What do I write over there? And that is why I would say we are fortunate that we're Indians, because in India there are so many examples that I certainly don't need to look beyond a person who specifically, very specifically, is a poet. How are poets unacknowledged legislators of the world? First example that I can write in my introduction, for example, I can give the example of a person called Subhadra Kumari Chauhan. What poem did she write? A poem that is known to every student in this country, I would say, I think I can confidently say, every student in the country in class 5th or class 6th. What is the poem called? Khoob Ladi Mardani, wo to Jhansi Wali Rani thi. Now, this poem was written in the beginning of the 20th century. And how is this a piece of legislation? Because it inspires our freedom struggle at the turn of the 20th century. In the first 2 or 3 decades, any time a person has any doubt, this is the poem. I won't recite it over here because I'm sure you know this poem. But the moment you recite the poem, you're suddenly inspired by a very fierce sense of patriotism, by a very fierce sense of duty, by a very fierce sense of pride in your country. When this poem is written, almost every person, you sing out the first line, it's impossible to stop yourself from singing the second line. Jhansi today is remembered. Dhyan Chand is from Jhansi, but it is remembered largely for Rani Lakshmi Bai. But if you ask people, it's the poem is about Rani Lakshmi Bai. Ask them who's the author of the poem. They don't remember. Largely, they won't know. That is why we say that the poet is the unacknowledged legislator of the world. In this case, for example, all the examples here, I'm just talking about India. If you want, we'll take a look at some other points. When we're writing the body paragraphs, you can use one of them also here. Similarly, after the 1962 war, when we were defeated by China, there was a poet called Kavi Pradeep. What poem did he write? What has now become a very famous song in India also, "Ae Mere Watan Ke Logo." And what is the impact over here? The nationalism that we saw in our country post 1962. After 1962, after getting betrayed by the Chinese, that is the time when it led to a surge of nationalism, helping us appreciate the sacrifice made by our soldiers and telling us that if we want to succeed in the comity of nations, we would have to look within. After this now, what happens after 62? After 62 now will come your green revolution, will come your white revolution. You'll strengthen your defense capabilities, you'll test your atomic weapons. All of that comes after this. Why? Because you must remember the sacrifices that people have made. Similarly, another example you can give is Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. And of course, one of the most famous poems of the country called Vande Mataram. What does Vande Mataram do? In two words, this one simple poem, these two simple words, become the battle cry of the Indian freedom struggle. Any person in the 1920s, in the 1930s, 40s also, anytime they want to glorify their motherland, they want to fight for their independence, these are the two words you'll hear most commonly in the country. And so on and so forth. You want to use more examples? Talk about Rabindranath Tagore, and that's your national anthem. You want to use another example, one of India's most patriotic songs, Sare Jahan Se Acha. This was written around the time of the 1905 partition of Bengal, when the British very clearly tried to divide our country on the basis of the divide and rule policy, Lord Curzon. Sare Jahan Se Acha, what does it teach you? It teaches you more than anything else the importance of unity in your country. Teaches you that you are a plural country, a plural civilization. So please have, again, what we say, unity in diversity. This is the same poem which somewhere in the middle says, "Mazhab nahi सिखाता, आपस में बैर रखना. Hindi hai hum, watan hai, Hindostan hamara." What are you doing? Unity. Today, if you ask an average student who has written this song, who has written this poem, they may or may not remember. And that's why we say that the poet largely remains unacknowledged. And yet he shapes the collective conscience of the country, telling us very importantly that no matter what the British are doing, it's very important that we understand that we are one unified nation. We are one people. Any of these 5 points written here, you can use 2 of them, one in the introduction and one in the conclusion. You have a couple of more of them left over, you can use them in the body paragraphs. But here, let's say we have these 5 here. I also have to write 5 body paragraphs. And that's why I said very simple essay topic once you interpret it correctly. Now here, if I have to write 5 paragraphs, there are different issues that we faced in India, issues that we've even faced on a global level. End of the day, the topic says poets are unacknowledged legislators of the world. And since we are talking about the world, these 3 poems I'm using from a global level. One from Britain, one from the US, and one from Germany. Why? To say that in any country, any society, poets have a very strong role to play. If you want, you can put 3 Indian over here. Pick up one Indian from the introduction and conclusion, add it over here. You want to put another Western poem, you can put that also. That's completely your discretion. But in the essay, you must have at least 2, minimum 2 outside of India and 2 or 3 from within India. For example, immediately after the massacre at Jallianwala Bagh, what became important? What became important, now this is 13th of April 1919, it becomes very important to have unity and fortitude in the country. Unity because everyone has to come against the British. Fortitude because we've suffered a terrible blow, not only in terms of number of people who were killed, but the impact it had on the psyche, the impact it had on the Indian nationalist movement. So here now, you have a poet called Bismil Azimabadi. If I ask students in a class who has written this poem, most commonly they will say Ram Prasad Bismil. Ram Prasad Bismil was the person who popularized this poem, who made it very famous. But the poet is someone else. And what is the poem? Sarfaroshi Ki Tamanna. सरफरोशी की तमन्ना अब हमारे दिल में है. That is the poem here. That no matter what, अब देखना है जोर कितना बाजुए कातिल में है. That no matter how much a person tries to defeat us, tries to dominate us, subjugate us, we are willing to sacrifice everything, but we will claim our independence at any cost. When does this come? After Jallianwala Bagh. What is the impact? That it creates within the country, within the people, a strong sense of unity and fortitude. Similarly, partition, of course, saw, the only word I can use here is horrors. The kind of butchering we saw of Indians killing Indians or Indians creating newly created Pakistanis is unprecedented. The horrors are something that are best forgotten. In these circumstances, what do we need? We need unity and peace. We need compassion. We need tolerance. We need solidarity. So here you have one of India's leading female poets called Amrita Preetham. And what does she write? She writes this poem called Aaj Aakha Varishanu, looking up to the famous poet Varisha and trying to understand why these kind of horrors have been visited upon the country. But when do I need this? Immediately after partition, to remind the people that we are still one. They might have become another country, but we are still one. There is no need to butcher each other. Now, we are writing again from a national or from an Indian perspective. Topic said, they are unacknowledged legislators of the world. So add a couple of global examples also. For instance, again, a poem that I think in NCERT textbooks is given in class 6th or in class 7th, The Charge of the Light Brigade by Lord Tennyson. Now, when was this poem written? Immediately after British lost in the Crimean War of 1854. At that time, what was needed? Now, for the British also, they are legislators of the world. So, for the British also, it was very important to glorify valor, to affix accountability, and to honor the supreme sacrifice that the soldiers had made. What happened with this charge? I'm sure you remember this poem from school. What happened during the charge? There was some miscommunication which even today we do not know why exactly it happened. But the Light Brigade was asked to charge against a regiment of Cossacks. When they charged, they were badly massacred. In fact, if I remember the poem correctly, I think the number that was given was 600. The 600 rode very bravely and so on. Out of the 600, only a few came back. So it's very important to glorify. They knew that the order was wrong. Somewhere in the poem it says, there's not to question why, there's not to make reply, there's but to do and die. You just have to do your duty, obey the orders. So glorify the valor, honor the sacrifice, and fix the accountability. And again, what are you doing? You are shaping the conscience of a nation, the conscience of a country at that point in time regarding the terrible misadventure that has just happened. Another example. Now here we are talking about patriotism, we are talking about partition, we are talking about a war over here. I can also talk about gay rights. Even today, especially in our country, everyone does not have a lot of sensitivity towards the LGBT community. Now here, there's a very famous poem called Howl by a person called Allen Ginsberg. And what does it do? What is needed at this time? To have some tolerance, to have some respect, to accord some dignity to people who have a sexual orientation that is not found in a large number of people. Nonetheless, they do have rights and they deserve to be treated with as much respect and dignity as anyone else. What does he do? He shapes now again the conscience of people towards this community or towards people who have a slightly different sexual orientation. And of course, a very famous poem that you can write is about the persecution of one community by another. This now, what is happening in the world? The Jewish Holocaust. The Nazis believe that the only way to revive German glory, to create a Third Reich, is through the complete mass extermination of the Jewish population. And here what is needed? You know that what is happening is definitely, deliberately wrong. So here what we need is the courage and the compassion to raise your voice, to protest, especially if you're a German. And here now a German poet called Martin Niemöller will write a poem called First They Came. I'm not sure if you read it or not, but if you read it, what is this poem? That first they came for one section of society, I was quiet. Then they came for another section of society, I was quiet. And so on and so forth. He goes on. And he says, in the last, he says, finally, they came for me. And there was no one left to stand up for me. What does this mean? That when you know that something is visibly and definitely wrong, You must have the courage, you must have the sensitivity and the concern to stand up for it. Now, who tells us these kind of thoughts? That is the poet. And these again are 5 body paragraphs that you could have written. But one final thing for this essay, when we say poets are the unacknowledged legislators, the interpretation we've already understood. A lot of content we already have, but please remember that in every single paragraph that you're writing, reinforce the topic repeatedly. Reinforce. For example, I have not written it here, but in your paragraphs, write how these poems, how these poets are influencing, are affecting the collective conscience of the nation, the collective conscience of society. That is what makes them the legislators. And again, that when we look at these poems, we might not remember who the poet was, and yet their words and their thoughts inspire us even today. That is why the poets remain unacknowledged. Simple topic. This is what you could have written here. Another topic then we'll take up in a subsequent discussion. Thank you very much.